back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, hosting him for a book talk is Patrick Alley. He's the co-founder of Global Witness, and we'll talk more about it momentarily. He's authored a new book called Terrible Humans, and it's a sequel of sorts to his previous book about very bad people, very bad humans, and we'll be discussing how he managed to gather such a collection of supervillains all in one volume. Global Witness, just to introduce it a little bit, is an international NGO working to break the links between natural resource exploitation, conflict, poverty, corruption, and human rights abuses worldwide. And it's based in both London and Washington, D.C. And we'll be getting into what that actually means and how that's related to the book. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up co-founding this organization.
Well, first off, thanks very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join. Yeah, well, I sort of got into this line of business, if you like, by accident. I spent my 20s working in the construction industry, which I found incredibly boring. I became increasingly interested in environmental issues, and cutting a long story short, I left my job, went traveling, then volunteered for a very small environmental organization called the Environmental Investigation Agency that looked at things like the ivory trade. Mm-hmm. And their modus operandi was to carry out undercover investigations, to get evidence and to use that evidence to create changes in laws, changes in international regulations. And I was volunteering there, and I met two other people in the same position as me, really. And we found we had a mutual interest in Cambodia. And back then, we're talking about the early 1990s, Cambodia was big news. It was the site of the biggest UN peacekeeping operation ever until that time, which was there to bring an end to a decades-long civil war between the infamous Khmer Rouge rebel group and the newly elected Cambodian government. And we saw news reports, just a few very vague news reports suggesting that the Khmer Rouge were trading in rainforest timber. Cambodia then had very rich rainforests with Thailand. And we thought that's presumably to raise money for the war. And we thought two things, really, one of which was that an environmental issue or a human rights issue? Of course, it was both, but no organization up until that time that I know of looked at that nexus. You had human rights groups looking at their stuff, environmental groups looking at their stuff, but no one crossing that nexus. And we thought, well, presumably, if you close the Thai-Cambodia border to the trade, you cut the funding to the Khmer Rouge, the war ends. Simple, sure. Why doesn't someone do that? And then we thought, why don't we? So that was the beginning of the idea of Global Witness.
That is fascinating. And how did you figure out what regions to focus on and how to essentially expose these issues? What was the methodology? How did you build it up?
Well, with that first idea, which was a very naive idea, but naivety is often a very powerful thing, or at least it doesn't put barriers in your way. We thought, okay, well, if we're going to do this, how would we, stop this timber trade? And we'd learned the methodology, as I say, from the organization we were volunteering for, which is to carry out undercover investigations. And so we thought, well, if we pretend that we're European timber buyers and go to the Thai-Cambodia border on the Thai side, on the Cambodian side, you would be killed by the Khmer Rouge, so the Thai side. find the timber companies who must be somewhere along that border, and with a secret camera film them and ask them how the trade works. And a simple enough idea, which it needed to be because we were very simple people and we had no money, no organization, no experience in this, in doing this. It took us about 18 months to get the money together. We started off by shaking charity collection tins outside London Underground stations at 5 a.m. to try and, see if the commuters would cough up enough money to help us. But of course, we had, we were a new organization. We'd created the name by then, but we'd never done anything. We had no track record. And consequently, virtually no one gave us any money. So that wasn't going to work. And so we started sending funding proposals out to other organizations. And I remember one was to Oxfam in the UK. And we actually managed to get a meeting with the second in command of Oxfam. And we were shown into his office and they said, oh, he'll be with you in just a moment. And we sat down and we could see our proposal on his desk. And we looked at it and he had written across it in biro, will they survive? And he obviously didn't think so because he didn't give us any money. But eventually the Dutch version of Oxfam, which is called Novid, did give us a little bit of money. And so in January 1995, myself and my colleague Simon Taylor rocked up on the Thai-Cambodia border with our newly purchased secret camera equipment, which is very cumbersome equipment back then, and embarked on what we said we would do. So we thought, well, where are these timber companies? And so we drove 3,500 kilometers along what's just a 700-kilometer border, probing every track that went towards Cambodia. And on many of them, we would find timber companies and we'd see timber coming across, which was completely illegal, according to Thai law and Cambodian law. But of course, on the Cambodian side, the border was controlled by the Khmer Rouge rebels. And we documented it. We managed to document that the trade was worth between 10 to 20 million US dollars per month. And with that information, we thought, well, okay, we have the information. What can we do with it? How can we get that to have an impact? And our former boss at the Environmental Investigation Agency had long ago said to us, if you want to change anything in the world, go to Washington. So we did. And we knew nothing about Washington. We didn't know how it worked. We'd heard of the Senate and the Congress, but we didn't know how they worked. But we had a very good guide in a woman who worked for Oxfam America called Kathy Knight, who guided us around Washington. And cutting a long story short, our information, our evidence carried through. And 5 months after that first investigation, the US had put a lot of behind the scenes bilateral pressure on Thailand, and they did close the border. So it proved that the methodology was right. And it came as an immense surprise to us. We just thought, really, it wasn't as hard as we thought it was going to be. So that was the beginning of us.
So where is Global Witness operating now? And does it still use the same methods, or is it also using more kind of undercover infiltration techniques as well?
Well, it was, I think that the history of Global Witness, because that was, just over 30 years ago, an awful lot happened in that time. We didn't just carry on doing exactly the same thing. The next campaign we worked on was the one we sort of became best known for in those days, which was, finally immortalized in the Hollywood film Blood Diamond. We realized that back in the 90s, there were 3 very brutal civil wars in Africa being funded by the diamond trade. They were in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Angola. And we thought, well, let's look at Angola and see if we can do there what we did, for timber funding conflict in Cambodia. What can we do about diamonds funding conflict in Angola? And I should add that this is part of our methodology. We were still only like 3 or 4 people. We couldn't work in all of those countries. but we thought if we pick one of them, and we picked Angola, then maybe if we succeed, what comes out of it will have an impact in those other countries. And we realized quite quickly as well, we couldn't use the same methodology. It's quite easy to pose as a timber buyer, even if you know nothing about timber. You cannot pose as a diamond trader and get away with it, because it's a very small business, a very closed business. Everyone knows each other. We did try it and we got caught. So we practiced. But what was on our side was that at that time, 80% of the world's rough diamonds were bought by just one company called De Beers. They were the company who created the very famous slogan, "A diamond is forever." And we focused on De Beers. And in a sense, it was kind of an unlosable campaign, because no one, when it comes to it, can defend carrying on a business which is resulting in the mutilation and murder of hundreds of thousands of people. And De Beers did try hard to sort of deny any culpability in this, but eventually, realized they'd have to come clean. And it resulted in an international process called the Kimberley Process, which was a UN-endorsed treaty, not a UN treaty, but a UN-endorsed treaty, to bring an end to a trading conflict diamonds. But sort of to come back to your question, what we had discovered in those two campaigns, which is now taking us, sort of 5 years on, was this issue of corruption, which we hadn't thought about when we began. I certainly didn't know anything about corruption, but we discovered it and we began looking at it, and we started investigations into different aspects of corruption. And as Aryeh Nair, who's the founder of Human Rights Watch, and by the time we met him, was the president of George Soros's Open Society Foundation, he said the birth in 1993 of Transparency International and Global Witness was the birth of the global anti-corruption movement. And so a lot of the period between then and up until a couple of years ago, we were essentially chasing down corruption in different parts of the world and in different forms.
Was there any sort of a pattern to how you chose where to go? I mean, corruption is endless. There's lots of it everywhere. How did you decide what was the worthiest target?
Well, basically, it began, a lot of what Global Witness has done is to sort of, for whatever reason it is, pick on a target, a subject, and then that usually leads us on to the next thing and the next thing. And so what we started with, having looked at one side of the funding and the civil war in Angola, we realized that the other side of the civil war, which is the government, so the diamonds funded a right-wing rebel group called UNITA. The government, the MPLA government, was funded by oil. That Angola is a very oil-rich, I think maybe the most oil-rich country in West Africa, certainly up there in that league. And whereas a government has the right to use its, natural resource revenues to fund its defense, no one knew how much money was being raised from oil. But the IMF thought about 25% of it was going missing. And it was going missing into a very corrupt cartel, not a cartel, a kind of little grouping at the top of the government, including the President Dos Santos. And so we thought, well, how can we stop that corruption? Because it's major oil companies. It was the oil majors, sort of, BP, Exxon, Chevron, etc. And we thought, well, we'll ask the government how much it receives from those companies. And the government refused, unsurprisingly, to tell us. And so we thought, well, okay, well, the companies need to publish what they pay to the government, and then we'll know. But more importantly, the citizens of Angola would know. And then they can hold the government to account. If they know how much revenue the government has, then they can say, well, why aren't we getting, hospitals and schools and roads and other infrastructure and other benefits as a society should have from a very lucrative business? And the companies refused to publish what they paid to the government. And then, but we conceived this term, publish what you pay, which has now become a movement of over 1,000 organizations globally, holding governments to account. And that in turn led to the creation of something called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, which brings together in resource-rich countries, but looking at oil and mining particularly, governments, industry, and civil society, where governments sign up and say, okay, we'll publish what we earn. The companies are then obliged to publish what they pay. And civil society has an oversight role. So if the numbers don't match, civil society can say, well, what's going on here? There's a problem. And so that was sort of the next phase. And then it went on from there. And we realized that every corrupt deal needs a bank. Because it's very easy to think corruption is something that happens over there. There's some dictator in some Latin American or African country or whatever who's very corrupt. That may be true, but who's paying them? Mm-hmm. And that's very often Western companies. How's the money get there? It's coming through Western banks, very often banks in London or New York or Frankfurt. And then we realized that every corrupt deal was generally run through anonymously owned companies. So we started a campaign looking at trying to get a public registry in various countries, which has largely succeeded in some areas. So in the UK, in the EU, in the US, mm-hmm. It's not universal, but there's far more transparency about company ownership than there used to be. So we kind of it developed that way. It evolved, and most of what we've done has evolved in that way. You start working on something and think, but unless we deal with this, we're not going to do it, and that, and you branch off.
So, interestingly enough, all of that puts you right now in the middle of this huge situation where we have, on the one hand, this big green energy transition move around the world. On the other hand, you have limited natural resources to fuel it, and you have this whole situation in African and other countries which is rife for exploitation in that regard. How, this seeming conflict of interest within the environmental movement or within this global move to embrace some aspects of environmental concerns, what happened when you ran into this, conflict?
Well, I think this is a really good question, and it's an issue that's far wider than the work of Global Witness. So I should sort of add a bit of context here that when we first started looking at corruption back in the 90s, as I mentioned just now, there were not many organizations in that place. And in 93 it was us and Transparency International. Nowadays there's a whole plethora of people looking at corruption, both non-governmental organizations, a lot of governments taking it more seriously, many more laws in place or more strictly enforced than they used to be. So the situation's very different. But you raise a really valid point in that you've got countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, just one, but one of the most resource-rich countries in the world, which alone possesses 2/3 of the world's cobalt, which is a mineral critical to the energy transition. Everybody wants it. So you've got everything from the kind of the major economic powers, so the China, the US, the EU, they all want to get their hands on these minerals. And with demand like that, then you see, the potential for corruption, for human rights abuses, for a whole load of things. So I think there's a real challenge right now, and also there is the environmental aspect of it. A lot of these transition minerals are called rare earths, and that's not because they occur rarely. It's because the percentages in the earth are very small, which means you have to mine an awful lot of soil to get the minerals you need, which is environmentally horribly destructive. And so a whole load of things come into play. So corruption is, of course, one of them. How to make sure that the government of the countries concerned are able to allow the exploitation of those minerals in a way that is fair, that is clean in terms of corruption. And also the people mining those minerals, because as I said, who pays bribes? Well, it's the mining companies that, if they were going to pay a bribe, is then that's going to pay the bribe, to the politicians. So that the corruption aspect is really important, but the environmental aspect is critically important. And the bottom line there is obviously you need to have very strict environmental regulations, but you also need to have the people of that country buying into it. Because too often what we see, and one of our major campaigns is on the killings of land and environmental defenders, those people around the world who suddenly find their land is in demand for whatever it is, whether it's minerals or cattle ranching or fishing or gold mining or whatever it might be. Those people have to have the final say in what's exploited and what's not on their land. The term is free, prior, and informed consent. And so there are people literally dying in a shooting war in many parts of the world, in Africa, particularly in Latin America, who are protesting against the exploitation of their land without their consent. And Global Witness publishes an annual report every year, and has done since 2012, when a former colleague of ours was murdered in Cambodia, to try and document the number of people who are being actually killed for defending their land and environment. And Global Witness published its report just a few days ago for the killings in 2023. It's just short of 200 people murdered in 2023 for this reason, and that's a very underreported number. We know the name of everyone that we put a number into our reports of, but there are many more people we simply won't be hearing about. And of course, there's also non-lethal attacks and criminalization. So there's a massive issue right now globally on this kind of issue.
Clearly, there's no exactly right answer on how to strike the balance, but it's very obvious that in some countries, no matter what laws you put in place on the US end or European end or or other Western company end, there is going to be massive human rights abuses in the process of mining, in the process of control over mines. And we have seen that. And then you have foreign actors coming into the country, like Wagner in some of the African states, that compound those issues. What should be the position of Western or other governments trying to get access to this resources if the governments in questions are not open to pressure on the human rights or environmental front? If all of this inevitably ends up in either massacres or just rampant abuses, is there any way to actually come to a right answer on this?
It's a really good question, and I don't think there is a very neat answer or easily available solution. So if the companies doing the exploitation are based in, or their homes are countries where there is a strong rule of law, so like Europe, the UK, US, whatever, then you can impose burdens on those companies to make sure things are done right. Those companies very often don't necessarily want to do things right. They're some of our biggest targets in the past have been, globally well-known oil and mining companies like Exxon and Chevron and Shell and whatever. But you can at least get them in the courts in your own country. But I think you raised the issue of Wagner, which I think is a really good example, in that what do you do in a country where your leverage is virtually zero? So, I mean, I've got the experience of working, the first place we worked, which I mentioned, was Cambodia, where there's an incredibly corrupt government, a corrupt dictatorship that's been in place since those just after those democratic elections back in the 90s. And there was, at one time, the possibility of using foreign aid as some form of conditionality. Half the national budget was made up of foreign aid. But as that shifted more and more towards Chinese aid as opposed to Western aid, then the leverage went down because China didn't care so much about those things. And we eventually stopped working in Cambodia simply because we had no leverage anymore. We could shout as much as we wanted. We were banned from the country, but we still managed to carry out investigations there. But it got to a point where we simply couldn't shift the government, and it, we or anyone else, including many of Cambodia's foreign partners. So you now have this dictatorship where, it's closed down free media, imprisons activists, etc. And going back to the Wagner example that you mentioned, a chapter in my book, Terrible Humans, I followed the work of a really brilliant American organization called The Sentry, who have been documenting Wagner's incursions into various countries. And I focused on Central African Republic, which is one of Wagner's sort of figurehead incursions. And it's basically a neo-colonialism where you've got countries that, like Central African Republic, or Niger or Mali, who former colonized countries, whose main relationship in those decades has largely been with the former colonizers, France in some cases, Britain in other cases. And then they sort of quite often have faced internal divisions, internal conflicts, which may be religious, may be ethnic. That's certainly true in those countries I've mentioned. And then Wagner rocks up and says, hey, we're guns for hire. We won't bring any annoying conditionality. We'll come and sort out your security sector for you. We'll protect the mines, in return for which we want gold and diamonds and whatever else it might be. And so you're seeing this neo-colonialism by which, and I'm sure you know probably better than I, on one level is a mercenary outfit, but on another level, it was the deniable arm of Russian neo-colonialism in Africa. And that, since the war in Ukraine, has become even more sort of, I don't think Russia cares particularly to deny it anymore. They're so blatant really in what they're trying to do there. So you do see, very resource-rich countries in Africa with terrible human rights issues and poverty, falling victim to a new colonialism. And like, colonialism was never nice, whoever did it, Britain or whatever, but arguably as bad as it's ever been, if not worse.
And that actually leads me to a great segue into your writing. So you two books, your collection of these villainous characters and entities from around the world. How did you come up with those particular stories? I mean, presumably they were in some way related to Global Witness work. And how did you structure them? Was it just different separate incidents, or were they in some way connected?
Okay, well, so my first book, Very Bad People, was essentially, I wrote it around about 30 years after Global Witness was created, and I just felt that there were some very interesting stories, because the kind of stuff we looked at were, genuine super villains, really bad people. We looked at some superheroes too, who were, trying to tackle them, but some really bad people, which is why it's called Very Bad People. And I thought it'd just be an interesting story, but I was also very conscious of the fact that NGO books by NGO people are very often the most boring books in the world. But I was lucky enough to get a good agent who said, write it like a TV series, write each chapter as though it was a TV episode. So I wasn't writing about a history of Global Witness, and I wasn't writing a memoir of myself. I was writing about various cases that we'd worked on. So I talked about, the Cambodia Khmer Rouge case. I talked about blood diamonds. I talked about various cases of corruption in the oil and mining sector and the killing of environmental defenders. But I did it very much looking at telling the stories of the people who carried out the investigations, which is actually quite exciting stuff. You know, going undercover, you know, dealing with maybe security services, CIA, MI6, dealing with some, you know, super fraudulent, corrupt people who are like, you know, real bad guys. Everyone likes stories about bad guys. And that's what it is. They're true stories. It's, you know, in Very Bad People, it's a collection of true stories which happen to be from the perspective of Global Witness, stories that I know. And, you know, they're certainly not all involving me. Some of them are the first ones, but they're colleagues who joined us later on, who just did these stunning investigations and exposed, you know, massive crimes. You know, like one of them, this guy, Benny Steinmetz, his company, Benny Steinmetz Group Resources, who essentially went into the Republic of Guinea and snapped up through corrupt means the world's richest untapped source of iron ore, and made billions out of it without ever having dug, you know, put a shovel in the ground. So exposing, you know, we had already exposed that, but I was writing the story about how it was done, who did it, how was an investigation working. And in Terrible Humans, the publisher liked the first one and asked for another, but we thought we can't really just do another load of Global Witness stories. And so we did a few, but I thought there's a real opportunity for me to tell the stories of organizations who work in areas that we've never worked in. So looking at things like the wildlife trade, wildlife trafficking, you know, ivory, rhino horn, you know, Global Witness has never worked in that. But, you know, I knew various organizations that had, and I talked to one called the Wildlife Justice Commission, who are an amazing outfit based out of the Netherlands, but very much international in its makeup. And they hire former cops, detectives, fraud squad type detectives, to infiltrate these multi-million-dollar wildlife trafficking networks. And wildlife trafficking is the fourth largest branch of organized crime, worth about 20 billion a year. Wow. It's massive, you know, and these are just, you know, one organization who went into it, but to actually hear how they did it, how they created their sting operations and get the bad guys. Another one looking at Sea Shepherd, which is a non-violent organization that tackles crime on the high seas, overfishing, whaling, and that kind of thing. And in this case, looking at operations by the Galician, the Spanish area of Galicia, fishing mafia, who had a fleet of secretly owned boats going down into the Antarctic and plundering the oceans there, multi-million-dollar business. And how this guy, the Sea Shepherd, went there, found them, and it resulted in the longest chase in maritime history. You know, they're just
That's
really good
crazy.
stories.
And this is probably one of the stories that no one's ever heard of unless you're directly working in those industries.
I think that's true. I mean, obviously, some organizations are much better known than others, but very often, you know, the average member of the public won't have heard. Maybe they may have heard of the issues, but not the organization, or vice versa. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write, because my target market is the general public. It's not for, you know, people I work with. It's not for specialists. It's for people who may know something and may care something about some of these issues, but don't know much about it and don't really know the work that goes into exposing the bad guys. And so there was a real opportunity to find some organizations who really wanted their stories told in a slightly different way, because, you know, Global Witness or Sea Shepherd or Organized Crime, Corruption and Reporting Project, another group I wrote about, they have their own, you know, very brilliant communication channels and their websites, but they're really preaching to, like as Global Witness does, to a relatively, you know, group of policymakers, perhaps journalists, whatever, but not necessarily to the wider public. And that's what I hope, in a very small way, I might have contributed something to.
So, among all these possible scenarios and stories you hear about, how do you decide which ones make it into the book? Are they based on people you know personally in some way? Are they brought to you by people who hear something interesting happening?
A bit of both. Sometimes it's the case that I find interesting. So, for example, I came across just in the course of ordinary reading of a journalist and his fiance who were murdered in Slovakia, which is sort of one of the star countries, small countries, but star countries of the EU. And a Slovakian NGO, not NGO, sorry, a Slovakian journalism outfit. He worked for one of them, this guy Jan Kuciak, but another outfit decided to investigate those killings, and it exposed, the prime minister who's had mafia links,
The current
exposed
Prime Minister, Fico?
of Slovakia had mafia links to the Italian mafia, and the involvement of organized crime, the corruption at high levels in government, the judiciary, the police, and this small journalism outfit exposed the lot. And it resulted, the death of Jan Kuciak, the murder of Jan Kuciak and his fiancée, resulted in the collapse of the government, the ousting of the prime minister, who has since become prime minister again, Robert
This is
Fico.
unbelievable. And, I should have heard about, the Prime Minister's Russian link and suspicious other things, but that particular story somehow did not make it into more recent coverage. It's as if the media has a very short attention span for these types of things.
Yes, I think that's a tragedy because Fico, he's sort of known as controversially as the strong man. He's quite pro Putin, but he's corrupt. And and that sort of seems to have gone by the wayside. As you say, memories are short. But anyway, I came across that story and I thought, well, I'd love to give that more coverage. And so I managed to contact, I know people, I know the founders of the Organized Crime Corruption Reporting Project who supported these investigations. They put me in touch with the main journalist concerned. She was happy enough to talk. And so that was that way around. The Wildlife Justice Commission, I'd met and I knew them. So they are often people I know or know of. But in the case of the Slovakia one, I didn't know anyone who's directly involved, or I didn't know anything about the case particularly, other than what was in the paper. So I just thought I wanted to have a selection of stories, not all about the same thing. So that's how I kind of generally put it together. And I guess the niche that I found is, I'm not doing the investigation myself. I've done them in the past. I know how it works, but I'm not doing these investigations myself. I'm telling the stories of people who do. And I'm hopefully telling stories which are very relevant to now. Some of them are historical, but they're very relevant to now and what goes on. And some of them are very current. So that's the way I've done it. And just for your viewership, I'm looking for some more ideas. So let me know.
I think there will be absolutely no shortage of these kinds of stories. Unfortunately, if anything, we are seeing the expansion of corruption everywhere. I mean, quite frankly, I think maybe at some point you may want to look at the information space and its links to corruption and how the exploitation of propaganda and social media is kind of bringing about this. I mean, between TikTok, Telegram, the recent scandal with Telegram, and Twitter/X, you've got a whole slew of nefarious activity out there, and nobody really knows how we got to that point. I think that would make for a very interesting tale.
I think that's a really good point, actually, because I think we see the benefits of social media, and we see, obviously, especially in terms of electoral issues, the abuse of social media, and Global Witness does a lot of work on that, on misinformation, especially around elections. So I did write a little about that in Very Bad People, but I think you're right, and it's become a bigger issue. And, to put that in context, as sort of as an older guy as I am now, is that when Global Witness started, there was something like 3,000 websites globally. There are now about 1.5 billion. So the way we research and the way crimes are committed and the kinds of crimes that can be committed that couldn't have been committed that way before, is legion. But I think that's a really good idea to look at the actual corruption in that space. Would be an interesting one. Yeah. So thank you for that.
So speaking of misinformation and social media, one of the issues that struck me looking at your new volume is the issue of surveillance and how I'm curious, do you see it as being related to the issues of corruption? Because it certainly strikes a somewhat different note from a lot of your other cases that are focused more on the environmental kind of sphere. So how did that come into play?
Well, I mean, as I say, we started off thinking about environment and
Mhm.
human rights and those two things. And I think in Global Witness's work, we certainly are very proud of our work in the environmental sphere, but equally proud of our work in the human rights sphere and the anti-corruption sphere. And a lot of what Global Witness does now, kind of, and has done for a while, has brought all of those things together, because a lot of environmental destruction wouldn't happen without corruption or violence. So it kind of comes together. But I think surveillance is a really good point, and I did write a chapter in Terrible Humans about the use of spyware and looking at Pegasus spyware. And again, this is an issue that's received a lot of newspaper coverage because journalists obviously are very often negatively affected by it. They are the ones being surveilled, and so there's been no shortage of coverage. But again, I went in to look at how in this case, in that chapter, an outfit called Citizen Lab, which is part of the Monk School at Toronto University, have become sort of one of the major sources of research and investigation, or rather information, into the use of spyware and how people's phones, computers, etc., are infected with spyware. And how that's used very often by autocratic governments to crack down on journalists, human rights activists, etc. So I think it's a critical factor. So if you look at some of the countries in the world with terrible human rights records, and you're looking at places like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or any dictatorship you care to name, anyone trying to report on environmental human rights issues is very likely to be surveilled by their governments and to face really awful consequences of that, which, one of the stories I cover is the murder and dismemberment of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, and how that works. That is a really disturbing area.
Actually, while looking up Global Witness, I came across your article from May about basically a phishing message that got brought Khashoggi into the situation. So I'm curious, how did you come across this information? Was it based on the media coverage at the time, or did you get to talk to some of the Citizen Lab people or other investigators?
Yeah, I think I knew dimly that in that case, Khashoggi's phone had been infected, but I didn't know the details of exactly how. And I think it probably was covered in the press, but I think what was really useful for me talking, because obviously, as I say, what I do is try and follow the stories of the people who are investigating. And so I talked with the guy who founded Citizen Lab, who was really, amazingly helpful and generous with his time to me, and told me about how, in fact, another activist, a Saudi activist based in Canada, got a message on his phone. He's typing away. He just ordered something on Amazon. Message pops up on his phone saying, oh, this is DHL, we want to deliver your parcel, click on the link. And so he clicked on the link, quite happy, didn't think anything of it, just to say, yeah, I'll accept my parcel. It wasn't DHL. And by clicking that link, his phone was infected. And then everyone he was in communication with, and he was very popular, still is, a very popular reporter on Saudi Arabian corruption and human rights abuses from Canada, because he's an exile. But that meant that, that clicking on that link meant that the Saudi government, who were behind the installation of Pegasus spyware on his phone, knew exactly who he was communicating with and what both sides were saying in their conversations. And that's part of the problem. And of course, he was in touch with this guy, Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist for the Washington Post. Khashoggi's phone is intercepted. He's tracked and followed and ended up dead. And yeah, so it was really important for me to be able to talk to Citizen Lab to get a better idea of how they work and how frighteningly easy it is for your phone to be infected. But if it's an iPhone, as I discovered in my conversations, then they can tell very quickly that it has been. An Android phone, less easy, apparently.
How did they get involved in the Khashoggi story to begin with? Were they asked by someone to examine any of the devices involved, or how were they able to kind of make that connection?
I think Citizen Lab, and they better answer the question than I would. But again, I do cover this a little bit in the chapter. They began looking at the use of sort of intercepted information, focusing, memory serves me right, for example, on the Chinese infiltration of the Dalai Lama's government in exile in Dharamsala in India. And they went out there and sort of checked their computers and whatever, and go back a decade or more, and finding out how China infiltrated networks of people that it didn't like, and gathered information on them. And then I think their work just evolved from that, not looking just at Pegasus spyware, but any kind of spyware. Just seeing how, I guess, they're an academic institution, they're not an NGO. And I guess what they're doing is, through documenting how this works and the kind of spyware that's out there, the kind of people that are running the spyware, the kind of people who are supplied it and what they do with it, is in itself a really important body of information. And then, of course, journalists or people like myself can use it to use that information to expose how governments are behaving around the world and the use of spyware. So it's really important work.
Yeah, actually, now that you mention it, Chinese spyware is now becoming very much a subject of interest, because there's been in this past year alone exposure of some private companies that are basically linked to the Chinese government, but they are essentially using commercial spyware, not just the regular government spyware, to essentially infiltrate the opposition, even private companies, and for espionage, and not just private rackets and ransomware and things like that.
Well, I think that's true, and I'm sort of far from an expert on this subject. I wrote about an expert from this subject, but in the case of Pegasus spyware, that's created by an Israeli company called NSO, and the reason it's popular, and it's been used by American intelligence and law enforcement, not necessarily illegally, but who knows, by UK, many governments, because it's better than a lot of government infiltration techniques. it's, you know, what NSO do, they obviously know what they're doing. They're very clever. They know how to, you know, nowadays, you know, that you don't even have to click on your phone to get infected. I don't know how the technicalities of it work. So they're incredibly sophisticated. And so governments buy it. Governments are the clients of a private company. But the Israeli government, you know, regard the spyware as so powerful that it's classified as weapon grade technology.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to get Israeli government, NSO has to get Israeli government approval to supply a particular client, and the clients can only be other governments. That's how the PR side of it goes. And I preface all this by saying when I was writing about this was before the terrible stuff that's happening in Gaza right now, and God knows what the Israeli government are doing with that spyware right now. But they made a big play of saying that, you know, of course, we would never supply spyware to be used, you know, where human rights abuses will occur. We won't allow it to be misused. But actually, the argument against that is, how do they know? You know, they refuse to say who they sell it to. And the people who bought it aren't going to tell you anything. So there are, in fact, no real checks or guarantees about that spyware. Yeah, so that's why I think it's, you know, obviously intelligence services do need to know what's going on to prevent, you know, mega crimes, to prevent terrorist activities and that kind of thing. But there needs to be a lot more regulation in there to stop it being abused for what could be commercial reasons or by a human rights abusing government clamping down on pro-democracy activists, for example.
I'll be honest with you. If I thought that my phone, if I had an iPhone and you know, knew that it would be so easily infected, I would probably use a different phone at that point and not use a phone that is very clearly a target of a well-known spyware. But that's, you know, that's just me. But that actually brings me to a question, kind of circling back to this environmental justice issue. One of the things you mentioned is that environmental activists can be often targets of this sort of surveillance. And I'm curious, amidst these wars for resources, especially in Africa, and we're seeing conflicts now, if not outright wars, but at least severe tensions and proxy conflicts between, for instance, Rwanda and DRC, and you know, other things that are going on, you know, this whole thing in West Africa. Are you seeing cases of activists being caught in that in the middle of all of this? And if so, you know, if everybody is likely to be surveilling everyone else, how do you kind of how do you make the distinctions? Who is the how do you find the good guys when you have these environmental conflicts over resources and other things? Are there any good guys in such situations, or are they all mostly villains?
That's a very big question. I just want to clarify something that you referred to just before the question, is that any phone can get infected with spyware. On iPhones, it's more easy to know that you have been. Android phones are just as susceptible, but just harder to know that you have been.
But I'm talking about specific types of, you know, spyware. For instance, not all spywares target all phones.
That I personally don't know the answer to. I think basically anything that's connected to the internet is interceptable.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair.
Would be the view. Going back to your question and your specific example, say, of Rwanda and DRC, which you know begs a bigger geopolitical question, like, you know, the UK government, for example, the past UK government, the recently departed one, wanted to deport all asylum seekers in the UK to Rwanda, saying it was a safe country to be. And you think, well, where did they get that idea? You know, because Rwanda has been, you know, bankrolling the rebel groups in Eastern DRC for decades, and is a bad actor and has, you know, a really bad record on human rights abuses. And, you know, a particular example I do write about in the book is It's not the main subject that I was writing about, but the guy who became famous in the film Hotel Rwanda, played by, I think it was Don Cheadle, if I remember rightly, a guy called Paul Rusesabagina, had to flee Rwanda when Kagame's regime was in power, and was tricked into going to the UAE and bundled on a plane and kidnapped and shipped off to Rwanda, where he was imprisoned. And he was tracked, by spyware. That's how they got him. So it's a really good reason, I think, to say, and obviously if you've got, a spyware company in a rogue state, then there's not much you can do about it. But if you've got a spyware company in a state that purports not to be a rogue state, then I think one should start having rules, regulations, and a lot of moral pressure, not for them not to supply that spyware to countries where it will be abused. And not just within those countries. So if you supply spyware to Saudi Arabia, they will use it, as again I write about, to target Saudi dissidents wherever they are in the world. So you should not supply spyware to governments with a record of serious human rights abuses, who cannot be trusted to use that spyware properly, and who very often will be targeting people who may well be imprisoned, tortured, or assassinated. All of those things have happened. And so far, I've not seen any sufficient regulation or common sense, really, in regard to that. It's coming in a little bit more. There are more digital protections coming in various areas, but I think we're behind the curve on that. And of course, NSO, the Israeli company, is one of the most powerful companies in this field. And rather like Rwanda, except more so, a lot of countries seem to regard Israel as a normal state, despite the fact, as has been shown in Gaza over the recent time, despite the terrible crimes that Hamas committed back in October. You've got a state which is carrying out genocide, which is disobeying international humanitarian law, which is shooting up aid convoys, killing aid workers, in addition to the tens and tens of thousands of Palestinians that have been killed. You can't regard a state like that as normal. It isn't. And obviously you can't stop them having NSO because it's an Israeli company, but you could sure as hell, if you're another, a foreign government, not buy things from NSO, not lend any kind of support, financial, moral, or otherwise, to a country like that.
But coming back to Rwanda and DRC, given that there is kind of mutual recriminations in that conflict, how, if you are a third party, do you make a decision on who to deal or not to deal with? DRC has accused Rwanda of bankrolling the M23 groups and others. Rwanda has accused DRC of something similar and basically meddling in their country. If you're forced to deal with those two countries and you're trying to develop a relationship, and in Rwanda there's been much touted regard for entrepreneurship among a segment of the population. How do you figure out which party is the more likely to be cooperative? And
well, I think in the case of Rwanda, it's Rwanda actually who's cited as funding, I believe, M23 and a lot of the other groups in Eastern DRC. And I know from our own research and others that obviously Eastern DRC is very mineral rich. There's a lot of artisanal mining, particularly of minerals like cobalt. And many of those are smuggled into Rwanda and exported as Rwandan production. Rwanda exports far more minerals than it actually possesses or mines. So in that case, I think you need to look at Rwanda and ask some questions of it. In the case of DRC, DRC is responsible for DRC's minerals, and notwithstanding decades of terrible conflict and corruption in DRC's minerals are sovereign. and you should only be buying DRC minerals from the DRC government, or rather companies who have the permission of the government. And that's not to say one shouldn't also obey all of the anti-corruption, environmental and other regulations that do exist, but may be being abused. Yeah, so I think, but it is difficult that, that area, the Congo Basin, particularly, not the whole Congo Basin, but, DRC, Rwanda, Uganda, there's a very troubled history over the past few decades. And it's not over yet, that the poverty, the destruction, the corruption that's going on there. So it's a difficult one.
Yeah, and Uganda too is also a growing concern in terms of terrorist groups and so forth. So that's going to be, I think that issue has not yet peaked, and perhaps could be a subject for your next group. What happens when cross-border ethnic and religious strife, ends up being exploited by state actors, or the other way around, ends up undermining legitimate governments.
Yes, I agree. I've been thinking about that one. So it's a question of where to start. It's such a lot going on there, and so many groups involved. I think the difficulty is sort of pinning down one story to follow rather than trying to write all of them.
That's true, though. Who knows? Given the tribal element there, even that one story may end up being connected to a lot of others. So
for sure, yeah, that's a good idea.
Well, thank you so much. This was really a fascinating look, and I hope the listeners will take a look at both of the books and certainly learn a lot of new things about investigations, and perhaps are motivated to then research both the issues and the organizations that are involved in them. I think there's a lot there, and I think there's a lot more great stories to tell in the future as well. And
well, thank you so much for that. And one thing I'd just like to say, actually, to pass a message on to your viewers and listeners, is that one of the things I really tried to tell is that actually, those people like me, my colleagues, and those in other organizations, we're all very ordinary people. We all came from very ordinary places. We weren't, my God, I wasn't a policeman. I had no experience in these things. I had no money. I guess the message is that anybody can do something, and sometimes quite a lot. So I know that a lot of people look at the state of the world, and me too, thinking, oh my God, it's awful. What on earth can I do? But actually, very often there is something you can do. And it doesn't have to be run off and start an organization. But I think the message is a message of that we all have some power, some agency, and we should use it.
I couldn't agree more. I think just hearing the inspiring story of how you started Global Witness from literally nothing and building it up into a very serious investigative outfit is motivating enough. If that's something that can be done, and people definitely can play some role to in whatever extent, in whatever their own capacity, for sure.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, and I certainly look forward to your next books, and of course following the work that you're doing as well. Best of luck.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Great to talk to you.
And for everyone joining us today, please come back next Tuesday night, 9 p.m. for our next program as usual. Thank you for joining. Thank you for listening. Have a great evening.